Hello everyone. So, Magnus Carlsen was once again dominant in this World Rapid Chess Championship. He went on to win 9 games, 3 draw, and lose only once. But it's that loss we're going to look at. A rather harsh defeat that left him frustrated. And in fact, we'll see at the end of the game that he makes a gesture of annoyance as he's being followed by this cameraman. And it's true that this cameraman is following him in a rather inconsiderate way. So, let's take a look at this game. Vladislav Artemiev has white, he starts with d4, and Artemiev will end up finishing second in this World Rapid Chess Championship, just behind Carlsen. Carlsen replies with d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit. White tries to lure the black pawn out of the center. Carlsen responds with a6, knight f3, knight f6, nc3, and c6. White plays e3. For now, there's not yet a critical moment, but we're going to focus on the different critical moments of this game, and that's going to happen soon. Knight d7, queen c2, bishop b6, pawn takes d5, first critical moment. Carlsen has to decide which pawn structure he wants to play, depending on whether he recaptures with the c6 pawn, the e6 pawn, or the knight on d5. If Carlsen recaptures with the knight on d5, white could play for a central pawn majority with the move e4, which attacks the knight and establishes a strong pawn center. So Carlsen doesn't want to recapture with the knight. If Carlsen recaptures on d5 with the c6 pawn, the position is symmetrical. In any case, the pawn structure is identical, with the open c-file. The problem for black is that white has already placed their queen on this file, and black has to deal with the move knight b5, which threatens to bring the knight to c7, supported by the queen, and which would create a fork of the king and the rook. So Carlsen chooses to recapture with the pawn. And now we have a different pawn structure. White has a semi-open c-file, black has a semi-open e-file. But white has an extra central pawn. They're going to make use of it. White plays bishop d3, bishop e7, kingside castling, bishop b7. And here, the second critical moment, white plays e4. So there will be a new modification of the pawn structure. Black cannot let the pawn advance to f5. If black, for example, does a kingside castling, this push to e5 drives away the black knight, opens up the attack on the h7 pawn. But even if white weren't able to win the h7 pawn, they would still have a majority of 4 pawns against 3 on the kingside. And so they would have a space advantage and many more opportunities to launch an attack against the king. That's why Carlsen decides to capture on e4. White recaptures with the knight kingside castling. And knight to e5, the third critical moment. For the third time in the game, the pawn structure is about to change. When Artemiev plays knight to e5, he's aiming for the black knight to capture, so he can recapture with the e-pawn. And to have this majority of 4 pawns against 3 on the king side, and to have this e5 pawn that drives the black knight away from defending the king. And Carlsen is going to accept. He will go ahead and take that knight on e5. The computer indicates that the best move, and probably the push to c5, which frees the bishop with an attack on the knight. The knight on e5 is still under attack, and the c5 pawn attacks the d4 pawn. There will be multiple exchanges, and in the end, this push is very equalizing. Additionally, the c-file could open up to the benefit of the rook on a8, which will come to c8, facing the white queen. On c2. So this push to c5 allows things to balance out. But Carlsen decides to capture on e5. Pawn takes. And this pawn will have a double effect in the attack against the black king. The first effect, as everyone realizes, is that it drives the black knight away from defending the castling. So there's knight takes, by the way, which leads to an exchange. Bishop takes, attacking the pawn on h7 and h6. And I invite you to find this fourth moment. Critical. What will white play in this position? So you can pause the video to take all the time you need to think about it. So what did you come up with? Here, Vladislav Artemiev is going to play the pawn to e6. He sacrifices his pawn on e6. And so that's the double effect of the pawn. The central pawn on e5 had driven away the knight f6. And now it can go to e6 to weaken the pawn on f7 and break down black's king's defenses. Carlsen is not going to accept. He is not going to take the pawn on e6. And he's even going to make a mistake here. which proves that this move to e6 unsettles him. But first, let's understand why Carlsen doesn't want to take. If black takes the pawn on e6, white has several options. They can play in a positional strategic way, for example with queen to c4 to attack the pawn on e6, which is pinned. If black plays rook to f6 to defend from the side, certainly b3 or even b4, with the idea of then placing the bishop on b2, and the rook won't be able to defend the pawn on the 6th rank, because there's also the light-squared bishop controlling the position. But what must have bothered Carlsen about this capture on e6 isn't even that move. Queen to c4? It's a much more forceful move. He was certainly afraid of bishop takes h6, with the idea that after pawn takes, anyway, black is pretty much forced to take here, because otherwise their king's shelter falls apart. So pawn takes and he wins the piece. But here, Artemiev could sacrifice a second piece, playing bishop takes c6 to be able to get into g6. For example, bishop takes, queen g6, check. And here the black king is left without any shelter. King h8, queen takes h6, check. King g8, queen g6, king h8. Artemiev can choose either to repeat moves and force a draw by playing queen h6, queen g6. You know that if the same position is repeated 3 times, the game is declared. Draw. But Artemiev can also decide to keep playing despite being 2 pawns down, and play, for example, rook to d1. That attacks the queen and prepares to transfer the rook to d3 and then to h3 to threaten checkmate. If the queen comes to e8, maybe queen h6 check to push the king to g8, and the rook can still try to join the attack. So now we understand that this move is critical, this push to e6, because in any case Artemiev can at least force a draw, or try to get more if the opportunity arises. So it's a very tricky move to handle, and Carlsen isn't going to deal with it very well. He's not going to take the pawn on a6, instead he'll put his queen on c7. And that, as we're about to see, it's a mistake. Pawn takes on f7, check, rook takes. And now what? Artemiev is going to take advantage of the missing pawn on f7, the open diagonal, and the poor placement of the queen on c7 with the move bishop to d5. The bishop comes to pin the rook, taking advantage of the open diagonal, and uses the pin of the c6 pawn, because the black queen is facing the white queen, unprotected. That's why you shouldn't have put the black queen on c7, but it seemed like a very tempting move to put the black queen on c7. So Carlsen is going to lose quality. He plays rook f8, and Artemiev plays bishop takes on h6. So Artemiev had planned this move, Artemiev, you see. Carlsen doesn't take, because if Carlsen takes the bishop, then queen g6, check, the king is forced to move aside. And after that, you can take the rook. In this position, white have a pawn more, a better shelter for the king. And the exchange on top of that, the advantage of the rook over the bishop. That's way too much, especially since there's a threat. Queen takes h6, checkmate, by the way. So after bishop takes h6, Carlsen doesn't recapture. He plays bishop d6. He attacks h2, and now he threatens to take the bishop on d5, since the bishop on d6 now defends the queen on c7. So Artemiev takes the rook on f7 with check, and now he plays queen to g6. He takes advantage of the pin on the pawn at g7 after having taken advantage of the pin on the pawn at c6. Bishop takes h2, check, king to h1, and bishop to e5. The rook comes to e1. Artemiev leaves the rook on f1 to protect the pawn on f2 and to prepare the f4 push. He wants to open the file for the rook so that his rook can access the d8 square. He has 2 rooks, so he needs to make use of the open files. Black to move. c5, Carlsen opens the long white diagonal. f4, the bishop can't take. If foo takes, there would be tour e8, a check. And if the rook moves back to f8, we can take on f8 and then win the bishop on f4. That's why Carlsen retreats to d6, but rook to e8 check, the bishop returns to f8. Rook to d1, aiming for the d8 square with the rook. Carlsen plays rook to f6, and here it's magnificent. A move by Artemiev. And I'll invite you to try to find it yourself, by the way. You can pause the video. It's one of the most beautiful moves of the game. So did you find it? Here, Artemiev is going to play the rook to d8. He leaves his queen because Carlsen can't take the queen. Otherwise, there would be rook f8, check, king h7, and rook h8, checkmate. A beautiful checkmate where the black king is completely smothered. And after rook to d8, black might try to take the rook on d8 and then capture the queen. But that doesn't work, because here white can immediately make checkmate with g7. Queen takes g7 checkmate, taking advantage of the pin of the bishop. Earlier, checkmate was not possible when the queen was on c7 and she was protecting the pawn. g7, but if she tries to sacrifice herself for the rook, then checkmate will be possible. So Carlsen plays bishop takes g2, check. He wants to deflect the queen, take the bishop on h6 with check. That's the idea. King to g1. And now he goes back to f6 to defend the bishop. But queen to d5 check comes, and here Carlsen can't block. If he puts the rook or the queen, there will be rook takes f8, and the rook on f7 is pinned. Way too many pin in this game. So Carlsen plays king to h7 and immediately resigns after making his move, because he realizes, of course, that he's losing the bishop. And with a piece down, it's now untenable for black, this position. So congratulations to both players for delivering this game. Congratulations to Magnus Carlsen for his beautiful title as World Rapid Chess Champion. He's collecting titles. Now the World Blitz Championship is starting. We'll see if he wins that one as well. And congratulations to Vladislav Artemiev for his title as World Rapid Chess Vice Champion. And for that very impressive victory against Carlsen. He was the only one to win a game against Carlsen in this championship. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me some likes, comments, share the video, and we'll meet again soon for new adventures. Goodbye, everyone.